Looking at my channel's analytics, my one video for toy collecting has done better than most of my role-playing game videos have, so here's some more toys, man. If that's what you like, I'm ready to pander, man. What's up, Internet? Jay here from Nerd Rage Against the Machine, and today we're going to talk about action figures. And more specifically, their evolution. There's a question I've always asked, being a child of the 70s and into the 80s, which was why we went away from this model. What you see here is a smattering of figures mostly from the 70s and 60s, and this is how action figures were when they started, really. Based a lot on that razor blade razor model that you see with Barbie from Mattel. The idea is that, you know, you've always heard, probably if you've hung around any kind of toy production discussions, you've heard about how tooling is super expensive. I've heard estimates of about $100,000 per figure. So one of the ways that they stemmed that back in the day was much like, say, a video game console might sell the PlayStation for a loss, but then you're going to buy so many games, and that's what's going to really make Sony that profit. The same thing was true here. So here's an example of a reproduction of Gi Joe. The body was pretty articulate for its time. And really what they did to sell this toy was, again, Joe was sold as a loss, but all the accessories and all the clothing packs and the frogman suit, the cold weather gear, that's where they made their money. That's where, you know, where this doll became profitable. So my question becomes, why did we go from this model, which was clearly imitated a lot, to more like this model, which, you know, He-Man here, who really doesn't have any accessories. You know, his real accessories are his friends, his colleagues, his enemies. You know, you have this idea that instead of a cloth costume, you just sell the figure as is and then sell multiple versions of them. And so I asked a certain toy guru this a while back, kind of as an academic question, because it really kind of, you know, was something that was on my mind. Why, if this is too expensive to make, why don't we make more like this? Why don't we go back to this? And why doesn't the toy industry at least try to promote such a thing? And so I use Batman as an example. You know, imagine when Kenner, you know, got the license for Batman and they made every kind of Batman under the sun. It wasn't like they were making a bunch of other characters. They made a crap ton of Batmans. And all those Batmans were basically repaints or different versions. And wouldn't something like, say, an 8 to 9 inch or even 12 inch Bruce Wayne turns into Batman be another way of doing it? And then from there, you know, sell those packs, sell the different outfits, sell, you know, maybe ones that are more collector leaning, like the Batman of Zero-On, or you know, or ones that kids would like, you know, like more like the Justice League battle armor thing that he wore in that movie. And what I got was a really flippant response about how once you've tooled this thing, a cloth cape is nothing. And that's really not what I was looking for, especially from somebody who worked in the industry and labeled themselves as a toy guru. And so while I am not the brand manager of anything, never have been the brand manager of any major brands of toys, I did what I think anyone who doesn't get the answer should do, which is I started doing research. Online, books, the whole 9 yards. And this is really what I found. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the history of action figures, and starting with this guy here, Gi Joe. Gi Joe was the brainchild of Don Levine. The story goes that Gene Roddenberry, of all people, of Star Trek fame, had approached Hasbro to market toys based on his new show, The Lieutenant. Yes, this was before Star Trek. And after watching The Lieutenant, Hasbro's brass were really kind of concerned because the show was, in typical Roddenberry fashion, very cerebral, very philosophical, and not something they could imagine little kids wanting to buy. However, Levine got this idea, Don Levine, that using an artist's mannequin to make a 12-inch figure that could hit any battle pose would be a hit. later watching a movie called The Adventures of G.I. Joe and finding out that the name G.I. Joe was not licensed, he grabbed it right up and was set to work making America's movable fighting man. Now, one of the interesting controversies at this time was that, Barbie was super popular. In fact, Hasbro had used Ken dolls to pre-measure and pre-test many of the outfits while the body was still being worked on. But when this guy hit market, parent groups were and parents in general were a little concerned. After all, 12 inches, cloth costume, he's a doll. And, the idea of boys playing with dolls, isn't that going to make them, gay? Of course not, but, parent groups think how they think. And you hear this kind of logic all the time. Many boys had easy bake ovens and may become chefs. It doesn't mean that they're not still interested in women, right? But there was a fear, so Hasbro, in a stroke of marketing genius, rebranded him as an action figure. Ken only has about 5 points of articulation normally, maybe a few more, but really all he needs to do is be able to sit in a car, sit at a restaurant, stand up, and dance with Barbie. Joe, on the other hand, needs to be able to crouch behind cover to get in behind enemy lines and take out the enemy. He needs to be able to crawl on the ground, to get into a sniper position, to do all these things that, frankly, Ken, as a civilian, didn't need to have to do. So, again, that's one of the things that made this doll popular. The other thing was that Hasbro had used one other thing from Barbie besides the cloth costume, which was the razor blade razor mentality of marketing, which is G.I. Joe might even be sold at a loss, but the accessories is where the money's at. When you're out buying him a frogman suit or a pilot's gear with working parachute or cold weather gear or desert or swamp gear, that's where the profit is, because the soft goods are so much less expensive than the tooling for the figure. And again, you've already got G.I. Joe once. How many G.I. Joes do you genuinely need? And at this time, G.I. Joe was built to be much like Barbie, an avatar for the kid of him in play. So, the thought was, I would bring my G.I. Joe to the playground, my friend would do the same, and we would both have G.I. Joes. Maybe I'd bring a locker full of extra gear so I could, set up his mortar or put him into cold weather gear if it was cold out. But ultimately, it was a 1-per-1 ratio versus that idea of having to have a whole army. No pun intended. Now, there were variations and there were reasons to get more, but ultimately that's really where we started with this. And this evolved. This line idea of the razor blade razor figure kind of took off all over the place. Another good example here is Captain Action. Now, Captain Action was from the 60s, made by the Ideal Toy Company, and they took the same concept as G.I. Joe and simply changed it to superheroes. Captain Action's power, if you will, is the ability to turn into any superhero that they can sell you. They would sell you the basic doll here, and they also made a villain called Dr. Evil. No, not that Dr. Evil. And they would each have different accessory sets, like Flash Gordon and Ming the Merciless, or Superman and Lex Luthor, or Batman and the Joker. Some of these didn't actually get made, but you get the idea is that, you could then turn Captain Action here into Spider-Man, and you could turn Dr. Evil into the Green Goblin, so that you would have this, plethora of action figures, even though you're really only getting one figure. And from there, we moved on to others. There were licensed examples, such as the Lone Ranger and the $6 Million Man here, and other generic ones, such as Steve Scout, which was Kenner's attempt at making a Boy Scout action figure. Unfortunately, the sample I have, I do not have the Boy Scout outfit. That's something I'm still looking for. But you get the idea. And again, he was meant to be more of a pacifistic answer to G.I. Joe. Instead of being out there in the woods killing people, he's out there in the woods camping. And the toy sets that came with him were examples of that. Fending off a rattlesnake or whitewater rafting down the Colorado Rapids. that kind of thing. We also have Big Jim, which also was meant to be competition for G.I. Joe in a similar way. Some might say that Big Jim was basically the male Barbie. His whole concept was he was a man of action, whereas Barbie would get, say, secretary or chef or ballerina outfits, especially earlier on. Now, granted, there were some more liberative examples of that as the line progressed, but Big Jim here would get things like big game hunter, karate expert, Olympic gold medalist, baseball, football, and that's really where he evolved. In fact, the cat that he would hunt would later end up in Masters of the Universe as Battle Cat. They would just reuse that same piece of tooling, which goes back to what we said earlier about tooling being expensive. So, yeah, if you can, you're going to reuse all this stuff. And even in those lines where you have multiple characters, such as the Lone Ranger, Tonto is basically, and Scout, Tonto's horse, are basically the same toy from the neck down. You can repaint silver to that kind of brown and white mottled colors of Scout, and Tonto can simply be the Lone Ranger in a different outfit with a different head. And you see that in a lot of these. Big Jim eventually would get a team called the Pack. In fact, here's my Dr. Steel from said team. And again, different head, make the hand silver to make it really cool. Even the same action feature, though, he's still basically Big Jim with a different head and things. And that's really where Mego started to come into its own. So this was Mego's first real action figure offering, a character named Action Jackson, which honestly was a knockoff G.I. Joe. Mego started life as a rack toy company, making a lot of super cheap things. In fact, the name Mego was Marty Abrams, apparently as a child, used to say this all the time when his dad would go off on business trips to buy toys from China and Japan and the like. Mego, Mego 2. And that's where the name comes from. And again, Action Jackson, due to his rather inexpensive body, he didn't have quite the quality build of G.I. Joe, and definitely none of the action features of like a Big Jim. He had one thing going for him, though, which was he was cheap to make. He was super cheap to make. In fact, they even did make a girls' line called Dynamite, which, again, you can tell it was the 70s. And she also came in a similar jumpsuit originally, but you would have accessories. He would have things like a firefighter, Australian Marine, cold weather gear. All those kind of things were available for Big Jim, but also vehicles. Now, I want to pull back there for a second because, yes, there were vehicles for G.I. Joe. Big Jim had plenty. Even $6 Million Man had his rocket. Captain Action had a vehicle or two. It wasn't unheard of, but the scale meant less materials, and it meant less tooling. And they could reuse certain vehicles and do different things with them. So Action Jackson kind of became synonymous with more stuff. On top of that, Mego would start buying licenses. Everything from The Wizard of Oz, Planet of the Apes, Star Trek, and of course superheroes. They owned at one point the license for both Marvel and DC, which was pretty insane. And this was their model. They would use the same body. I mean, Action Jackson would be used for Captain Kirk, would be used for Taylor from Planet of the Apes, or Dr. Zaius. It would also be used for Superman. So all you have to do is change heads, change outfits. In fact, even the Thing, the Marvel character, was basically their slightly larger body, but in a bodysuit that was drawn with little orange rocks. So they were cheap, but at the same time, you could make so many characters. And the size, which is really, I think, where I want to go with this, is part of that change as well. Smaller characters meant, and cheaper purchasing, meant that you could collect a set, an ensemble cast. Whereas, again, the $6 Million Man, there were other characters. Same with Captain Action. The selection was still really limited. I mean, $6 Million Man, you had Oscar Goldman, you had the Bigfoot, and you had the Maskatron. 2 villains and a support staff. But really, he's your guy. He's the one you want. He's the one that really matters. Captain Action was the same way. He had his junior sidekick Action Boy, and then he also had Dr. Evil for a villain to fight, but really you didn't have a whole squad of characters versus something like, say, Star Trek, where you have, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, or, DC or Marvel superheroes, who wouldn't want the entire Fantastic Four, or the whole of the Avengers and Spider-Man and the entire Justice League. Now, so that's one thing that this really did, is they made that scale to make things more convenient. And to make, again, a cheap figure that you could sell, and they could, still use that one tooling to really fray costs, and then just change the soft goods, change the head, and boom, you've got an army of different characters that kids want, even if they're literally buying the same toy more than once. And that's what leads us really into this more modern era that we see today. Now, shrinking figures down to make vehicles was nothing new. In fact, probably one of the earliest examples I could find was this guy here, Major Matt Mason, Mattel's Man in Space from the 60s. This is a one I restored, but he's basically a bendy whose big advantage was he was small enough that you were really buying the vehicles. A cool figure, but it didn't really last super long. The other big example of small and vehicle-based would be this guy right here. This is one of Fisher-Price's adventure people. And this line would probably be the real impetus. What happened is, Fisher-Price would make these very durable for younger kids, 3, 4, 5 years old, with bright, colorful vehicles that, again, could really stand the test of time. Finding samples of adventure people stuff, even today, in working order is pretty easy. So when George Lucas came along with Star Wars, and yeah, that is kind of a big part here. I don't think anyone who's a pop culture toy collector is going to be able to ignore that elephant in the room. Lucas came up with this idea for Star Wars, and it was marketed all over the place. In fact, the story is he went to Mego, and they were a little leery because of the fact that movies didn't really sell unless they were a full series, that was already proven, like Planet of the Apes. You had a lot of TV stuff. I mean, think about the fact that Mego greenlit Happy Days, the Gary Marshall sitcom about a family in the 50s with the Fonz, but turned down Star Wars. Now, again, hindsight, that is absolutely insane. They also did the Waltons, for God's sake, in that Mego 8-inch scale, but passed on Star Wars, of all things. Well, the license would go to Kenner, who before that had limited success with Steve Scout and more success with Steve Austin, the $6 Million Man. And it was their decision to shrink that scale down for vehicles, that the Millennium Falcon was going to be the centerpiece of any toy collection for Star Wars. And having characters being able to interact in that play environment, and again, not make it a playset, but an actual full vehicle, was part of their plan. So they made them the smaller scale, like our adventure person here. In fact, just like Ken would be used to model G.I. Joe outfits, pre-production Star Wars, to show off what they were going to look like, Kenner had bought several adventure people figures and repainted them and, kit bashed them into, here's kind of what a Star Wars toy line would look like in this scale. This camper is now Han Solo, he's painted the same, and we take this, this kind of guy, paint him white and, modify the head until it looks kind of like a stormtrooper, and that gives you your idea. Well, to say that Star Wars took off would be an understatement, and there are just an absolute metric ton of videos out there on YouTube cataloging Star Wars as a franchise and as a toy line, so I'm going to kind of gloss over it, but just give you that idea of, that's really what started this trend. Beyond that, though, once the 80s came around and the regulations on TV shows as commercials kind of went the way of the dinosaur, thanks to Reagan. Reagan had kind of allowed for the idea of making TV more commercial, and part of that was allowing shows like He-Man or G.I. Joe to air. Hanna-Barbera had tried it in the 60s or 70s with Hot Wheels, and the FCC squashed it like a bug. But Reagan had made these changes, so it's a freeform. It's the Wild West, boys and girls. Let's do it. And that's really where the action figure boom started. And one of those things is, again, people looked at Star Wars as a successful line and they wanted to emulate it. G.I. Joe would be reborn in that 3 3/4 inch scale, and again, taking away the idea that he was an avatar for your child. You didn't have G.I. Joe and then a boatload of vehicles. You had a team, 13 characters to be precise, 10 heroes, 3 villains, and that line would of course bloom beyond that. But even at that point, the line was about vehicles. You had the Mobat tank, the Vamp, the Ram, and it would only snowball from there. And yes, this is definitely one of the things that is, what makes that line sing is, compare the original G.I. Joe Adventure Team helicopter, which was basically a super small bell that would barely fit one man. You might be able to hang someone off the grappling hook at the bottom or one of the pontoons in some variations, but not much more than that. And compare that to, say, the Tomahawk that the G.I. Joe would come out with, which I think easily could carry about 10 men. And put them in positions, pilot, co-pilot, a couple of side gunners with those side doors going back and forth, and this would be where things would go. And with the success of that, we also started getting into characters. It wasn't just He-Man as an avatar, it was He-Man and his friends, Man-at-Arms, the Sorceress, and variations. And again, those vehicles became part of it. I mean, you could sell vehicles for a bigger price and also, have different characters ride different vehicles. That's really where this evolution became true. And of course, even with Transformers, the idea was we may be, again, tooling costs expensive, but apparently well worth it. And Hasbro got away with, Transformers got away with this mostly by repainting guys. The idea that Starscream, Thundercracker, Skywarp are all the same dude. Ultra Magnus is basically a repaint of Optimus Prime here, in some variations. And that's really where this idea of collect them all came from. The idea that we, instead of making 1 or 2 figures, we would instead have you complete a set, over 100 action figures. And that definitely worked for a lot of things. Star Wars was a good example. I mean, there were, in the 70s at least, of actual different figures made, and a lot of background characters, things that you wouldn't have thought of. Comparing this to something like the Lone Ranger or $6 Million Man, where 4 figures was probably your max, and really one of the things they kept doing to refresh the line was give Steve new arms, give Steve new techniques. Which was tougher for some of the villains, but they would, come up with other things, I'm sure, if that line had continued or been successful enough to continue for whatever reason. But in these cases, that ensemble cast is what makes it, and there are definitely experiments in size, such as Hasbro's Cops here, which were slightly larger figures, and and eventually nowadays, the lines tend to go towards something like this, which is a 6-inch. This is a Kanan Jarrus from Star Wars Rebels. Hyper-realistic, sculpting. Looks great, don't get me wrong, and the articulation is way closer to G.I. Joe than the old Star Wars figures. But that high articulation, plus the size, there are less vehicles, but again, it goes more toward collecting the whole set. I can't just have Kanan. I've got to have Ahsoka to go with him. I've got to have Ezra and all the other cast of Rebels, and the same with collecting a Star Wars range or a Marvel range or a DC range. That's where you go. You have that idea that you need the whole set, or even like Build-A-Figures. This is Duncan Idaho from Dune, and again, you have to buy all the characters from Dune to get Raban, because he's in parts in the boxes. And then when you get all 4 boxes, you have enough stuff to put Raban together. And that's from the upcoming movie. Again, that hyper-realistic, somewhat articulated, but no cloth. And part of that, again, is when you shrink those figures, those soft goods look worse. When you've got a smaller figure, even really, something the size of a G.I. Joe or a Barbie, the clothing is far more sheer than it would be on a normal person. And that's to help create the illusion of that miniature size and that miniature scale. But in these cases, you're starting to really experiment more with, to hell with that, and let's just make them, let's just craft the clothing on. But again, these are all tooled. And in something like Star Wars, there's no way that you're going to reuse parts from Kanan here to make Ezra or to make Hera or Sabine. It's just not going to happen. And there's also, I think, a demand by fans and even kids to want more articulate, more realistic figures as opposed to the old stuff. Look at an original Darth Vader and compare him to even, I have a Cartoon Rebels Vader who looks just leagues above the old 70s one in terms of his actual look, in terms of the sculpt. The original Vader didn't have anything to do with that undercloak that Vader does wear in the films, but he's passable. And the original Luke doesn't look anything like Mark Hamill. He looks like a blonde kid cosplaying. And so this is really where that mentality is gone. And I kind of miss the old cloth stuff. Now I know there are collectors and adult collectibles that still do that still do have that range, and that's cool. But it's not the same as as making something mass produced. Again, the toy industry sure is going to be mostly for kids. People collect it, don't get me wrong, but that's really where its heart is and really should be. It is toward kid collectors and kids that want to play with this stuff. Heaven forbid you buy it and keep it in the box. And the funny thing to me too is, I'm a parent. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and what I see is that this is now starting to kind of seep toward girls' toys as well. My daughter's obsession is a toy line called LOL dolls, and LOLs are all in their own self-contained ball and randomly packed, so that the idea is you keep buying the same figure or same product, same SKU again and again in hopes of getting a different figure. And again, rapidly repainted, because what they're doing is they're just making a bunch of characters. This one's called Sugar, this one's called Spice, this one's called Unicorn, this one's called, whatever. Trust me, as a dad, you hear these names enough, you start memorizing them even when you don't want to. This is why I know all the stuff I know about My Little Pony, despite a flaming desire not to. But that's really where, back to my original point though, that's where collecting has gone, and where it seems to be heading is more toward hyper-realistic, figures, but at the same time, that collect 'em all mentality has taken over versus vehicles, because again, at this scale, they can make vehicles, but it's far more expensive and far more problematic. Where you're going to store them. The Millennium Falcon was huge. Even at the heyday, something like the Flag was an impossible dream to own for most kids because that thing was 7 foot long. Where are you going to store that thing? And at 6-inch scale for like the new Gi Joe figures, hell no, they're not going to make a Flag. Not a chance. You'll be lucky when they make. You are lucky if they make things like the Ram Cycle. They're not going to make that Tomahawk in that scale because the tooling and the cost is just not going to be there. So I guess this is both a rant and a lament. I do miss that idea, and it's kind of perplexed me as to why we haven't tried it again if tooling is so damn expensive. And I think it really does come down to the idea of we're chasing that collect 'em all dragon. That idea that there's greater profitability in having a pool of figures that you have to get everyone. And even more so when you start looking at these things like, that are coming out like LOL, where it's all random, where you don't know what you're buying. Again, back in the day when I was a kid and I would look at the toy rack, I would see, ooh, there's Boba Fett, I want Boba Fett. I'm going to hold off on Bosk, he just doesn't interest me, as an example. Or I really want Man-at-Arms, but Snout Spout, he's a peg warmer. That's a way, again, of them changing up the game and making it so that, now random He-Man figures, I've got like 14 Snout Spouts and 3 Mechanics and still can't find Skeletor. And that's really where this line, where it's heading for profitability, unfortunately. Personally, I would love to see them try a line to go back to something more like the personal avatar play style and again, the costumes. But honestly, I also don't think that it's very likely, which is unfortunate. I think there are certain properties and certain ideals where that would work, where you could revisit that, and I think that kids might even be up for it. It's just, again, what sells is what sells, and if they, when they see trends, they glom on them. So that's where we are. So with that, I'm going to end this video, and may all your card backs be smooth. May you enjoy your hobbies, and like, share, and subscribe if you like this video. In the meantime, take care, guys.